So today, we will focus on one life process, one organ system, specifically yung ating digestive system. And our essential questions for our topic today is, what is the pathway of food across the digestive system? Meaning, ano yung kumbaga, ano yung magiging travel ng food from the very first time that it enters your body until such a time that it exits your body. And then, of course, with that understanding or with that knowledge, come up with ways on how we can prevent diseases in the digestive system. So let's start. Ayan. So let's focus first on the pathway of food along the digestive system. So we have to remember that the digestive system is actually composed of 4 processes. The first process is what we call as ingestion. The second process is what we call as digestion. The third process is what we call as absorption. And then the last process is what we call as excretion. So if you will remember last week, when we talked about the different characteristics of living organisms, sabi natin, living organisms have the ability to gather food. And then, pag na-gather niya na yung food, it has to be taken inside the body. And then the living organism has to digest it. And then not everything will be digested, sabi natin. Not everything is usable to the body. So dapat merong mechanisms or meron ding processes inside the living organism which will allow it to remove those parts ng kinain niya na hindi naman nagagamit ng katawan. So that is what we call as excretion. And later on, when we follow the pathway of the food across the digestive system, we will be identifying saang part yung ingestion, saang part yung digestion, saang part yung absorption, at saang parts na yung excretion. Okay? So, let's start with the digestive process. So, sabi natin, everybody needs to eat food. So, sana kayo ay meron ng kinaing pagkain kanina before mag-HRG or habang nakikinig dun sa 9 a.m. class, or during the asynchronous in between the 10 a.m. and the 11 a.m. class, sana nakapagsingit na kayo ng kinain. Kasi kung hindi, most likely baka nanghihina kayo or wala kayong masyadong energy kasi wala pa kayong kinakain, so wala pang napagkukuhanan ng energy yung inyong mga katawan. So sabi natin, the reason why we are eating is because our body uses a lot of energy. And the energy that our body uses comes from the food that we eat. So tayo, mga tao, we are categorized as heterotrophs. So last week, di ba, we learned about the autotrophs and the heterotrophs. So sabi natin, heterotrophs, ito yung mga organisms that don't have the ability to create their own food. Hindi tayo tulad ng mga plants na ginagamit lang nila yung heat or yung energy coming from the sun and then they can create their own food. Hindi ganun ang tao. We don't have the ability to create our own food. Kaya tayo kumakain ng other organisms to provide us with energy. So, ang kinakain natin usually, yung mga plants at saka yung other animals. And then from there, we get the energy that we use for our everyday activities. So, the first part is what we call as ingestion. So, coming from the word ingest, ibig sabihin, this process focuses on ensuring that the food goes inside the body. Kasi kahit mag-gather mo yung food, kung hindi mo naman siya kayang i-ingest, hindi siya usable sa iyong katawan. So the organs that is responsible for the ingestion of food is actually your mouth. So syempre, ang entryway or yung pasukan ng food in our body is through our mouths. Okay, so the first organ will be inside the mouth. And inside the mouth, meron siyang mga accessory organs dyan. Meron tayo yung nose. Syempre, nag-i-increase ng appetite yung nose lalo pagka naaamoy natin yung aroma or yung bango ng pagkain. Kaya nga pagka kayo ay may sakit or may sipon na hindi kayo makaamoy ng maayos, wala rin kayong ganang kumain. Kasi hindi na stimulate yung olfactory nerves ninyo. So, hindi niya na-i-increase or hindi niya na-send yung signal sa brain na, uy, may mabangong pagkain, kainin natin siya. So, wala kayong ganang kumain kasi hindi ninyo naaamoy yung pagkain. Okay, so related din yung nose ninyo sa digestive system, even though it is also part of the respiratory system. And then, of course, we have our tongue. And in the tongue, we have our taste buds, which is able to detect, syempre, yung chemical stimulation ng mga pagkain. Kung matamis siya, kung maasim, maalat, ganyan. So, part yan in motivating us to ingest more food. So, syempre, habang mas masarap yung pagkain, mas napaparami yung kanin, mas napaparami yung kain ninyo. Okay? So, part din yan ng ingestion process. So, pag nakapasok na siya sa loob ng katawan, that's when the digestion process will happen. So, the digestion process actually starts in the mouth. So, pagpasok pa lang niya, your body is already starting to digest the food that you are eating. And in your mouth, there are two kinds of digestion that happens. The first is the mechanical digestion. So when we talk about mechanical digestion, it means that we are changing the physical or the mechanical aspects, characteristics of the food that you are eating. So for example, in terms of size, pinapaliit mo yung kinakain mo. So, mula sa isang malaking tinapay, you take a bite of it, so mas lumiit. Nung inuya mo siya, mas lumiit siya until it reaches doon sa point na pwede mo na siyang lunukin. Okay? So, that is mechanical digestion. And yung marireceive po ninyo na module, tomorrow, in the afternoon, you will be doing an experiment which will allow or which will demonstrate to you the importance of mechanical digestion in the entire digestion process. Okay? So, science tayo, no? So, sometimes meron akong ipapagawang experiments sa inyo para mas maging malinaw yung concept. I made sure that these experiments are actually doable at home. So, ibig sabihin yung mga materials available siya sa mga bahay ninyo or pwede ninyong palitan. For example, instead of test tube, pwede ninyong palitan lang ng glass na baso. Ayan. So, meron kayong marireceive tomorrow na isang simple experiment that will demonstrate the importance of mechanical digestion. Okay? And then, other than the mechanical digestion, which happens in your mouth with the help of your teeth, syempre, yung ngipin natin ang nagka-crush at nagbabite at nag-ensure that the food that you're eating becomes smaller and smaller enough for you to swallow. So, meron ding nangyayari na tinatawag nating chemical digestion. So, when we say chemical digestion, ibig sabihin, we are already changing the chemical properties of the food that we are eating. So, as early as in the mouth, meron ng mga chemical changes na nangyayari dyan sa mouth ninyo. And chemical digestion happens in the mouth because of the presence of amylase. So amylase is actually an enzyme that digests starch. And this amylase, this enzyme, is found in your saliva. So merong enzyme inside your saliva that can only chemically digest starch. Okay? So, for example, pag kumain kayo ng tinapay, specifically yung pandesal, ano ang lasa ng pandesal? Meron bang pwedeng magtaas ng kamay at magsabi sa akin kung ano ang lasa ng pandesal pag kinain nyo siya? Yung walang palaman.
Starchy po, ma'am.
So, anong lasa ng starchy?
Matabang po, parang ganun.
Matabang? Okay. Any other answer?
Maalat po.
Maalat? Okay. Any other answer? Maalat ba ang pandesal? Yung malunggay pandesal? Ano? Sino makakapagsabi sa akin kung anong lasa ng pandesal? Yes, Lucien.
Matabang.
Matabang. Okay, yes. Matabang siya kaya usually nilalagyan siya ng palaman. Pero ano yung lasa na matabang? Kasi pag sinabi nating matabang, di ba? Maalat pero kulang sa alat, ganon. So ano yung kulang sa pandesal? Ano yung matabang na lasa niya? Yes, Ivan?
Ang parang ano, ma'am, medyo matamis na kulang.
Okay, sige.
Kulang
Thank you, Ivan. So, ang lasa ng pandesal ay medyo matamis, pero matabang na tamis. Yung parang hindi siya overpowering na tamis. Okay? Pag tinignan natin, para sa mga mahilig magluto or mahilig mag-bake, pag gumawa ka ng pandesal, hindi mo kailangan maglagay ng asukal. Ang natural na ingredients ng pandesal is harina, asin, at saka tubig. At saka syempre yung pampaalsa, yung yeast. So pag tinignan natin yung recipe niya, ang nilagay lang natin ay asin. Dapat maalat yung pandesal. Okay? Pero pag kinain natin siya, hindi yung alat yung nalalasahan natin. More of yung matabang na matamis na aspect. So later on siguro pag kumain na kayo ng merienda or tomorrow pag kayo ay nag-almusal, double check ninyo anong lasa ng pandesal or ano yung lasa ng mga pandilimon or tinapay. Kasi yung mga yan, wala silang asukal. Naturally, ang nagpapatamis lang dyan is yung flour. Okay? And yun yung dahilan kung bakit natin nalalasahang matamis yung pandesal. Kasi yung flour na yon is a carbohydrate. Okay? It's a starch. At nadidissolve siya or nadadigest na siya chemically nung amylase na meron doon sa laway natin. So these starch are already being digested into monosaccharides or glucose. Kaya nalalasahan natin yung tamis, medyo matabang na matamis. Kasi as early as in your mouth, the starch is already being digested. Okay? So, nagkakaroon na ng chemical digestion dyan, pero yung nadadigest lang niya is yung sugar components. So, pag kumain ka ng protein, kahit gaano karaming lamay dyan sa bunganga mo, hindi madadigest yung protein. Kasi ang kaya lang i-digest ng amylase is starch. Okay? So, starchy products such as noodles, pasta, bread, and rice. Okay? So, ayan. So, na-digest na mechanically and chemically yung pagkain sa bunganga pa lang. And after that, kapag enough na yung, anong tawag dito, yung saliva na nag-mix na doon sa food na kinain mo, then that is what we call as your bolus. So the bolus is a combination of the chewed food. So sabi chewed, di ba? Ibig sabihin kinagat or ninuya na siya at saka nung saliva that was produced in your mouth. And the bolus will now enter the esophagus. Okay, so the esophagus here is basically a muscle. It's a muscular tube that connects your mouth going to the stomach. Okay? So dahil muscle siya, ang ginagawa niya, nagkakaroon ng muscle contraction in your esophagus which will push down the food mula sa iyong mouth papunta doon sa stomach. So ipupush niya dito, mapupunta siya sa baba, ipupush ulit, push, push, hanggang sa makarating siya doon sa stomach. Okay? So now it reaches your stomach. And this is your stomach. Okay? So in your stomach, ang mangyayari doon sa bolus, they will be added with gastric acids or what we call as gastric juices. Primarily, they are made up of pepsin and hydrochloric acid. Sulat ko ba? Hydrochloric acid and pepsin. Okay, so these are the gastric juices that will be added to your bolus. Okay, so pag in-add na natin yung hydrochloric acid and pepsin to the bolus inside the stomach, then it will become what we call as your chyme. So the chyme is a combination of the gastric juices, the saliva, and then of course yung food na kinain mo. So what's the importance of these gastric juices? The gastric juices will now continue the chemical digestion. And this is the reason why in your stomach, napakababa ng pH level niya. Very acidic ng inyong mga stomach. You have to remember that hydrochloric acid is a strong acid. Kung meron sa inyo na ang ginagamit sa bahay na panglinis ng kubeta ay yung, anong tawag dito? Meron yung kulay yellow na Nakalimutan ko yung pangalan niya. So that is actually a weaker version of the hydrochloric acid. So can you imagine kung weaker version pa yung pinanglilinis sa toilet bowl ninyo, how much acidic yung nandito sa loob ng stomach ninyo. And then pepsin is another acid that is specifically there to chemically digest your proteins. So, ida-digest niya chemically yung food na kinain nyo until everything becomes liquid. So, this chyme that we are talking about, this is a liquid version of all the food that you have eaten. Kaya pag kayo po ay nagsuka, it's either dahil biyahilo or dahil masama yung pakiramdam ninyo. Kung papansinin ninyo, maasim yung lasa ng suka ninyo, tapos mabaho siya, tapos masakit siya sa lalamunan. Bakit? It's because of the gastric acids. So, it's already digesting the food that you are eating. Kaya, pag lumabas siya, kasamang lumalabas yung gastric acid, minsan masakit siya sa lalamunan kasi nagkakaroon ng chemical burn doon sa inyong throat. Tapos, maasim siya kasi usually talagang maasim ang mga acids. Yung amoy nila yung amoy na maasim ng acid. Okay? So, yan yung dahilan doon sa kung bakit ganun yung experience niyo pag kayo ay nagsuka. May mga nagsusuka na may mga food particles pa, pero may mga nagsusuka na completely wala ng food particles. Ibig sabihin, chemically digested na talaga yon. So in your stomach, the food will stay there for how many hours until it is completely digested. Kapag liquid na siya all throughout, the chyme will now exit the stomach. And now it will enter the small intestine. Let me zoom this one. So this is your stomach. The pouch here is your stomach. And we have what we call as your small intestine. Okay? So the small intestine is the one that's inside in the middle. Ito siya yung nasa gitna. And it is divided into 3 parts. Okay? The first part of the intestine, directly after the stomach, is what we call as the duodenum. And then after the duodenum, it will go to the jejunum. And then the last one is what we call as the ileum. So bakit natin kailangang i-differentiate yung parts ng small intestine? It's because they have different functions. Pagdating sa duodenum, the small intestine, or specifically the duodenum, will continue the chemical digestion of the food that you're eating. So hindi pa tapos yung digestion sa stomach. The digestion will continue in the duodenum. But this time, iba na yung dadagdag na acids sa kanya. Hindi na gastric acids in the form of hydrochloric acid and pepsin. This time, ang idadagdag na sa duodenum is bile. Ito siya. Bile, for those of you who eat yung papaitan, ito yung kulay green or dark green na nagpapapait doon sa papaitan na kinakain ninyo. And this bile is actually produced by the liver. Ang gumagawa ng bile ay yung liver. And then pag nagawa na siya ng liver, it is stored inside the gallbladder. So the green part here is what we call as the gallbladder. Ang function lang niya is to store all of the bile that was produced by the liver. And then, kapag ka nagda-digest na siya, the gallbladder will secrete the bile into the duodenum. So, ano ang purpose ng bile? Bile is the one responsible for the digestion of the fatty acids. Lahat ng oils na kinain ninyo, lahat ng oily food na kinain ninyo, will be chemically digested in the duodenum by the bile. Okay? So, yung bile na yan is very important. Otherwise, hindi maki-chemically digest yung mga fatty acids na kinakain ninyo. Okay? Other than the bile, meron pang dadagdag doon sa duodenum. So, zoom ulit natin. Kung mapapansin niyo sa likod nitong stomach, parang merong kulay puti na organ dito. And this is what we call as the pancreas. Okay? So the pancreas will produce the pancreatic acid. And pag na-produce niya na yung pancreatic acid na yan, other than the pancreatic acid, the pancreas also produces yung insulin. Pero i-discuss natin yung insulin later siguro as part of the circulatory system. Okay, so this pancreas will produce the pancreatic acid, and this pancreatic acid will also be secreted in the duodenum. Tapos pagdating niya sa duodenum, it will digest chemically lahat ng proteins at lahat ng carbohydrates doon sa kinakain natin. Okay, so after the duodenum, tapos na yung digestion process. So the digestion process happens in the mouth, it happens in the stomach, and it also happens in the small intestine, specifically in the duodenum. Okay, so yun na yung end of digestion. So when we say digestion kasi, ibig sabihin, kino-convert natin the food that we are eating into something na kayang i-absorb ng katawan natin. So yung kinain mong pandesal, hindi naman siya kasya dun sa mga veins and arteries mo. Hindi naman siya kayang i-absorb ng katawan mo. So the pandesal, which is a form of carbohydrate, specifically starch, will be converted into glucose. Glucose kasi ito yung starch component na kayang i-absorb ng ating katawan. So at the end of digestion, all of the rice that you're eating, all of the bread, the pasta, and the noodles, they have to be converted into the form of glucose. And at the end of the digestion process, which is in the duodenum, lahat na ng yon ay in the form of glucose. So pag nasa form of glucose na siya, for sugar, it means na ready for absorption na siya. So magko-continue na yung food na yon into what we call as the jejunum. So sabi natin, the small intestine's second part is what we call as jejunum, and this is where the absorption process actually happens. So in the jejunum, the nutrients coming from the food that you are eating or you have eaten is absorbed. So pag sinabing absorb, ibig sabihin, i-transfer na siya ng cells inside the jejunum from the small intestine going to the red blood cells. Kasi yung red blood cells ang magdi-deliver nitong mga nutrients nito into the different cells of the body. So yung glucose is now transferred from the small intestine going to the red blood cells. So yung red blood cells na yun, kumukuha sila ng nutrients in this part of the small intestine. So all of the nutrients now are absorbed. Ano yung nangyayari doon sa hindi na-absorb? So that is what we call as your feces. Okay? Or in layman's term, ito yung mga pupo ninyo or poop. So the feces, this is the undigested material from the food that you ate. So ibig sabihin, hindi siya na-digest. So dahil hindi siya na-digest, hindi siya kayang i-absorb. At dahil hindi siya na-absorbable in the body, it's not useful, kailangan siyang alisin. So the undigested material in the form of feces will now continue to the ileum, and then from the ileum, it will now continue to the large intestine. So meron din tayong tatlong part of the large intestine. So the first one is the ascending colon, ibig sabihin pataas. And then we have the traversing colon. And we have the descending colon, ibig sabihin pababa. So as the feces travels along this large intestine, the absorption actually continues. Okay, so ano ang ina-absorb pagdating sa large intestine? Ang ina-absorb is water. Okay, so kung mapapansin niyo yung mga feces niyo, they're usually compact, di ba? Ang tawag dito, yung compacted sila kasi na-absorb na yung water and moisture from the undigested material. So hindi basa usually yung mga feces ninyo, lalo na pag completely na-undergo niya ng maayos yung digestion process. May mga circumstances lang naman wherein nagkakaroon ng watery feces, di ba? For example, pag nagkaka-diarrhea. So in that case, hindi niya na-follow normally yung digestion process. And later on, we will explain kung bakit nangyayari yun. Okay? So, ang ina-absorb So continue pa rin yung absorption in the large intestine, pero ang ina-absorb niya na is actually the water. Because water is essential in a lot of chemical processes that happens inside your body. So the production of energy in itself uses water. So kailangan mo ng water sa katawan. So yung water coming from the undigested food, ina-absorb siya ng large intestine. Until such a time na pagdating niya na sa descending colon, wala na halos siyang ma-absorb na water. So now it will store all of these undigested material or feces in the rectum. And then when the rectum reaches a certain level, for example, 70% capacity na yung feces na nasa loob ng rectum, the rectum will send a signal to your brain. Sasabihin niya sa brain na, uy, na-reach na yung capacity, so kailangan mo nang magbawas. And then your brain will send a signal, yun na yung masakit na yung tiyan mo, gusto mo nang magpunta sa CR. Pag pumunta ka ng CR, the feces will now exit through the anus or the anus. So the anus is the opening. Ito yung exit way ng mga feces or undigested material. So yung absorption happens in the jejunum of the small intestine, and of course the large intestine here, absorption of water, and then the excretion happens of course doon sa anus or anus, where the undigested material actually exits the body. So nakompleto niya lahat ng 4 processes na to, lahat ng 4 characteristics of living organisms in just a single organ system. Okay, we have 2 minutes before the meeting room ends. Do we have questions coming from the class? Wala naman, so far malinaw. Okay, so let me continue with my slides. Okay, so now let's focus on the different diseases or mga sakit that is commonly experienced in the digestive system. So for this class, I will focus on 4, specifically in terms of malnutrition, diarrhea, constipation, and gastritis. Okay, so malnutrition is the first one. And I focused on this, or mas gusto ko siyang i-discuss on the first one kasi in the Philippines, malnutrition is a very extensive problem. A lot of children are experiencing malnutrition, and a lot of adolescents, regardless kung aware kayo or hindi, you are experiencing what we call as malnutrition. So I'll continue this